I had planned the trip for months. It wasn't supposed to be anything dangerous or unusual, just a long solo hike in a part of Idaho I hadn't been before. The kind of hike where you just walk, sleep under the trees, listen to the quiet, and clear your head for a few days. I had picked a remote loop trail that I found through a forest forum online. It was part of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, near the Montana border. Hardly anyone talked about this section of the trail, which was exactly what I wanted. Less traffic meant more peace. I started the hike on a Tuesday morning in late September. The weather was good, cool in the mornings and a bit warm in the afternoon. It was dry too, which meant I didn't have to worry about my gear getting soaked. My plan was simple: 5 days of hiking, loop back to the car, head home. I had a paper map, compass, and my GPS. I had packed enough food and water purifying tablets to last more than a week. My tent was light, and my sleeping bag was made for freezing temperatures. Everything was in order. The first day went smooth. The trail was narrow but clearly marked. I didn't see anyone else, which was a bit eerie at first, but I got used to it. The trees were dense on both sides, mostly firs and pines. The air smelled clean, full of that piney scent I always liked. Every few hours I'd stop, drink water, eat a granola bar, stretch my legs. I made camp just before sunset near a small creek. The ground was soft there, covered in pine needles. I ate some freeze-dried rice, set up my tent, and turned in early. The second day, things changed. I'd been hiking for about 4 hours when I noticed the trail getting faint. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's normal for less traveled trails to fade here and there, especially in the wilderness. I kept going, trusting my GPS and map. But the trail didn't just fade, it disappeared. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. I stopped, looked around, checked my GPS. It showed I was still on the route, but when I compared the terrain to the map, things didn't line up. The creek I passed earlier wasn't marked. The elevation felt different than it should have. I thought maybe I had taken a wrong turn. That happens sometimes when you zone out, especially if the trail isn't clearly marked. So I turned around. I figured I'd just backtrack until I found where I went wrong. I walked for a good hour before realizing I wasn't seeing anything familiar. The trees looked the same, but I hadn't passed that large rock formation before. And the slope I was climbing wasn't there this morning. I tried not to panic. I sat down, drank water, ate a protein bar, looked at my GPS again. The signal was spotty. The map showed my location, but the terrain it displayed looked off. There weren't supposed to be cliffs nearby, but I could see one up ahead through the trees. I waited for the GPS to resync. Didn't. I tapped it a few times, even restarted it. Same issue. It just didn't match what was in front of me. I stayed calm. I told myself to trust the compass and the paper map. But even with those, I couldn't be sure. The map was small scale, more of a guide than a detailed layout. It didn't show the small landmarks I was seeing. Fallen trees, dry creek beds, oddly shaped boulders. I decided to keep moving downhill, thinking I might run into a marked trail or a larger creek. Water often leads to civilization. I kept walking for hours. The forest got thicker. The ground was uneven and slippery in some places. I crossed a stream I hadn't seen on the map. Then I climbed a ridge that overlooked more forest, just endless green. No trails, no signs, no people. I was off the trail, deep into the wilderness, and I didn't know how it had happened so quickly. That night, I made camp on a flat patch next to a fallen tree. I didn't bother setting up the tent. I just rolled out my sleeping bag and lay there, staring up at the trees. I heard sounds in the distance, twigs snapping, animals moving. Could have been deer or elk, maybe even a bear. But I had no food out and I kept my bear spray close. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept thinking about how I got turned around. I wasn't new to hiking. I had done solo trips before. I always kept track of where I was going. I paid attention, but somehow this time it wasn't enough. On the third day, I decided to head northeast. Based on the sun, I figured that would eventually take me back toward the original trail. I checked my compass often, made sure I didn't veer off too much. I moved slower that day, mostly because the terrain got rough. The ground was covered in dense underbrush, fallen limbs, and sharp rocks. Every step felt like a risk. One bad fall and I'd be stuck. It happened just after noon. I was climbing over a patch of moss-covered rocks when my left foot slipped. I went down hard, landing on my side. Pain shot through my leg immediately. I lay there, breathing heavy, trying to assess the damage. I didn't hear a snap or pop, but my ankle throbbed like hell. When I tried to stand, it buckled. I sat for nearly an hour, drinking water and resting. I wrapped the ankle tight with a bandage from my first aid kit and used a stick as a crutch. The pain made every step worse, but I kept going. I had no choice. I was limping through a shallow ravine when I found something that made me stop cold. A piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was red, maybe from a jacket. I pulled it off the branch and looked around. Not far from it was an old, rotting backpack half buried in leaves. It was torn, chewed up by animals maybe. The zippers were rusted, and the straps were broken. Inside were a few crushed food wrappers, a cracked water bottle, and a faded map. The map had handwritten notes on it, but the ink had run, and most of it was unreadable. There was no sign of the person it belonged to. That hit me hard. I kept thinking about what could have happened. Someone else had gotten lost here, someone who never made it back. Maybe they sat where I was sitting, thinking the same things I was thinking. Scared me more than anything else. That night, I barely slept. The cold crept in stronger. I had a small fire, but I was too afraid to let it burn high. I kept hearing things. Not voices or anything unnatural, just the forest. The wind pushing through the branches. The occasional rustle of something moving nearby. The snap of sticks. I kept clutching the bear spray like it was the only thing keeping me alive. By the fourth day, I was desperate. My food was running low, and the ankle wasn't getting better. I decided to follow a small stream, hoping it would lead me out. Waterways usually go downhill and eventually hit roads or bigger rivers. I followed that stream all day. I slipped a few times, soaked my shoes, scraped my hands, but I kept going. The trees started to thin out a little. The slope got steeper. I was hopeful. Around sunset, I saw something through the trees that stopped me again. A fence. It was old and broken, made of rusty wire and wooden posts. It looked like the edge of some private land or maybe an old ranger boundary. I followed it. Eventually, I saw a dirt road. It was overgrown but still there. I limped toward it, almost crying with relief. I followed that road for miles. The sky went dark. I kept walking with my headlamp on, ignoring the pain in my foot. Close to midnight, I saw headlights. A pickup truck came rumbling up the road. I waved my arms and stood in the middle. The driver hit the brakes and jumped out. He looked at me like I was a ghost. I didn't care what he thought. I pointed behind me, shook my head, and leaned against the truck. He helped me in and gave me water. I couldn't stop shaking. He drove me to a small ranger station about an hour away. They checked me over, gave me food, called in help. I gave them my name, showed them where I thought I'd gone. The rangers said I had gone nearly 20 miles off course, straight into a patch of forest that wasn't even covered well on standard maps. When I told them about the old backpack I found, one of the older rangers went quiet. He said someone went missing out there a few years back, hiker, mid-30s, solo trip like mine. Never found. No body, no gear, just gone. They never searched deep in that direction because the terrain was too rough. They asked me if I wanted to go back with them and show them. I said no. Took a week for my ankle to feel normal again. I stayed in a small motel near the ranger station before catching a ride back to my car. When I opened the door and sat behind the wheel, I cried. I had made it back, but something in me had changed. I still hike sometimes, but I don't go alone anymore. I don't stray from the trails, and I don't ignore my instincts. I still think about that moment when the trail vanished, how quickly everything turned. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the person who left that backpack. I wonder if they had the same plan I did, a simple, peaceful hike. Maybe they slipped. Maybe they got too far off track and couldn't find their way back. Maybe they're still out there, just bones under a thick layer of leaves and moss. And I think about how easily that could have been me, how close I came. I've been hiking for over 10 years. I started small, easy day hikes on local trails, gradually moving up to multi-day backpacking trips. Over time, I grew confident, maybe a little too confident. I knew how to pack light but smart. I knew how to navigate without cell signal. I knew what poison ivy looked like and how to read weather from clouds. That kind of confidence can be good, but it can also get you into trouble if you're not careful. This story is about one of those times. It happened in late October a few years back. I was 35, in decent shape, single, no kids, and living in northern Colorado. I had a long weekend ahead of me, and I wanted to get away from town and spend a few days off-grid. I didn't want to deal with permits or crowds, so I decided to head to a less popular area in the Routt National Forest, not far from the Wyoming border. I picked a route I found online that looped through a quiet valley and up toward a remote alpine lake called Lost Echo. The trail wasn't well marked, but that was part of the appeal. According to a blog I read, it was about 32 miles total, doable in 3 days if I moved steadily. I printed a basic topo map and packed enough for 4 days just in case. I brought my tent, pad, sleeping bag rated for cold, water filter, extra socks, food, bear canister, and my usual first aid kit. I didn't bring a satellite phone or PLB. I'd never needed one before. The first day was easy. I parked my truck at the trailhead, just a dirt pull-off beside a gravel road, and started the hike under a cloudy sky. It was chilly but dry. I moved through pine forest, my boots crunching over dead needles and frozen leaves. The trail was narrow, clearly used more by elk and deer than people. Every so often I'd see faint boot prints or old blazes on trees, but mostly it felt wild and untouched. I made it about 10 miles that day, stopping to camp near a creek in a flat patch of woods. I didn't see a single person the entire time. That's what I liked. Complete quiet. No cell signal, no road noise. Just wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of squirrels or birds. That night, it dropped below freezing. I curled into my bag and slept hard after the long hike. The second day started out great. I followed the trail as it climbed gradually into higher elevation. The trees thinned a bit, giving way to brush and patches of exposed rock. I came across some old elk bones, picked clean, probably from last year's winter kill. I passed a few streams, topped off my water, and kept moving. That afternoon, I reached what I thought was the halfway point. I recognized a wide flat meadow from the topo map and figured I'd make it to the lake by evening. The weather had held up cold, but no snow or rain. I kept my fleece on and kept moving, thinking I'd be at the lake in time for an early dinner and maybe even a little fishing if I had the energy. But somewhere after that meadow, things got off. The trail became faint, almost impossible to follow. I looked down and realized I hadn't seen a proper blaze in over an hour. I checked the map and tried to orient myself, but the trees were thicker now and the slope was steeper than I expected. I figured I must have drifted slightly off the trail during a break or while navigating around fallen trees. It happens. I wasn't too worried. I backtracked a little, trying to find the last clear marker I remembered. Couldn't. Everything looked the same. Pines, rocks, deadfall. No footprints, no blazes, no cairns. I told myself not to panic. I still had food, water, and plenty of daylight. I knew roughly where the lake was, so I decided to bushwhack northeast for a while and try to pick the trail back up. It was slow going. The terrain was rougher than the map made it look. Steep, muddy in places, and full of thick underbrush. I pushed through it, breathing hard, feeling my legs burn. The sky was getting darker, even though it wasn't evening yet. I realized I hadn't eaten in a while, so I stopped to dig a bar out of my pack and catch my breath. That's when I saw the clouds rolling in from the west. Fast, thick, dark clouds, the kind that bring snow even when it's not in the forecast. I felt the temperature drop sharply. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees. It was already cold, but now it was biting. I pulled on my shell and kept moving, trying to get some elevation so I could get a better sense of where I was. I reached a ridge just as the snow started. Big, wet flakes at first, but quickly turning powdery. Visibility dropped fast. I couldn't see more than 100 feet in any direction. My tracks vanished behind me in minutes. I knew I had to set up camp. Fast. I found a spot behind a large boulder, somewhat sheltered from the wind, and pitched my tent in record time. My fingers were stiff from the cold. I crawled inside, peeled off my wet layers, and got into my bag. I boiled some water for dinner, ate half-heartedly, and listened to the wind howl outside. Snowed all night. When I woke up, the ground was covered in at least 6 inches of fresh powder. Everything looked different. Trees I thought I recognized looked the same. The trail was gone, buried. My map was now borderline useless without being able to see landmarks. I still thought I could orient myself if I headed downhill, follow water, get back to lower ground, and maybe find the trail again. I packed up and started hiking again, this time moving slower and more carefully. My boots were soaked within an hour. My socks too. I had spares, but I didn't want to stop long enough to change them. The cold was too sharp, and stopping meant losing body heat fast. I moved through a narrow ravine, thinking it would lead me back toward the meadow, but it just led me deeper into a tangle of brush and steep, icy slopes. At one point, I slipped on a patch of frozen mud and landed hard on my side. My water bottle rolled down the hill and disappeared. I didn't even try to retrieve it. By afternoon, I knew I was lost. Really lost. I had no idea how far I'd drifted from the trail. My compass told me I was moving southeast, but nothing around me looked familiar. Every ridge looked like the last one. Every tree seemed the same. I came across what looked like an old hunter's camp, just a flat spot with some cut logs and rusted cans buried in the snow. I used that spot to make camp again. I changed my socks, built a small fire, and tried to dry out my boots as best I could. I rationed my food more carefully now. No more hot meals, just bars, nuts, and jerky. I had enough for maybe 2 days if I was careful. The next morning, I woke to find the firewood buried in another few inches of snow. My lighter barely worked, and my hands were too cold to strike a match properly. I got a small fire going again, enough to warm my fingers and sip some hot water. That day, I decided to keep heading downhill. I figured if I followed water any creek, I'd eventually hit something. A road, a cabin, anything. So I followed a frozen stream, slipping on rocks and ducking under branches. The snow made everything harder. Every step took energy. Every branch dumped cold powder down my neck. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen any fresh animal tracks. No deer, no squirrels, nothing. That was strange. Even in snow, you usually see signs of life. But it was silent. Too silent. The only sound was the wind and the crunch of snow under my boots. That night, I couldn't start a fire. My hands were too numb. I huddled in my bag, shaking from cold, listening to the wind scrape through the trees. I couldn't feel my toes. I kept wiggling them, telling myself they were just cold, not frozen. The next morning, I knew I was in trouble. My feet were swollen, pale, and stiff. I forced my boots on anyway, laced them tight, and kept moving. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted to find a road. I kept following the creek, which had turned into a small river. After several more miles, I saw something wood, cut and shaped, not natural. I pushed forward and found what looked like an old wooden footbridge, half collapsed. It hadn't been used in years, but it meant I was close to something man-made. I followed the river, now with more hope. By late afternoon, I came to a dirt road, snow-covered, but unmistakable. I nearly cried. I followed it for another 2 miles before I saw a sign nailed to a tree. Forest Road 823. I didn't know where it went, but I knew if I followed it long enough, I'd hit a junction. That night, I camped beside the road, too exhausted to keep going. I used the last of my food. I didn't even bother trying to start a fire. I just slept cold and hungry. The next morning, I forced myself to hike again. My legs barely moved. My feet were throbbing with pain. But around noon, I saw tire tracks, fresh ones. I followed them, and a mile later, I saw a truck parked beside a gate. I collapsed beside it, too weak to yell. I waited. After what felt like hours, a man came walking up from the woods, rifle slung over his shoulder. He was hunting elk. He saw me, asked if I was okay, and helped me into his truck. He drove me to a ranger station where they gave me water, a blanket, and called an ambulance. had frostbite on 4. It was late September when I decided to take some time off work and head out into the mountains. I had been feeling burned out from the long hours in the office and the constant emails, meetings, and noise. I needed a reset. I didn't want to go to a resort or a beach. I wanted silence, cold air, and trees that stretched higher than buildings. I wanted to be out in the open, where I could hear my own breathing and not much else. I chose a long hiking trail deep in the mountains of northern Washington. It wasn't very well known, but I read about it in an old forum post by a guy who said it was one of the loneliest, most peaceful routes he'd ever taken. That was exactly what I wanted. The loop was about 35 miles, mostly uphill through thick forest, past a couple alpine lakes, and across some rocky terrain. It would take about 3 days if I moved at a decent pace. I packed accordingly: tent, sleeping bag, layers of clothes, a gas stove, water filter, and freeze-dried food. I arrived at the trailhead around 9 a.m. after driving all night. It was colder than I expected, and I could see my breath when I stepped out of the car. The air was still and quiet. I was the only one there, no other cars. The dirt parking area looked untouched. It made me nervous for a second, but I shook it off. This is what I wanted, after all. The first day was uneventful. The trail started off wide and soft, covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. It wound slowly uphill through dense trees. I walked for hours, stopping only to drink water and adjust my pack. I didn't see a single person. No hikers, no signs of human presence. Just squirrels, birds, and the sound of wind in the branches. By early evening, I found a good spot to set up camp. There was a small clearing not far from a stream. The ground was flat and dry. I pitched my tent, filtered water, and cooked one of the meals, chili and rice. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset. I bundled up and crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the forest creak and sigh in the darkness. I was asleep within minutes. The second day started off normal too. I packed up, ate a protein bar, and got back on the trail. The path got steeper and rougher, with more rocks and fewer trees. The views opened up in places, and I could see miles of wilderness stretching in every direction. The silence was deeper up there. I felt like I was the only person alive. I reached one of the lakes around noon. It was frozen around the edges, and there were patches of snow along the trail. I took a long break there, sitting on a boulder and staring at the water. There were no ripples, no fish jumping, just stillness. It was beautiful and a little eerie. That afternoon, I started feeling something I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't anything I could see or hear. It was more like a change in the air. The wind felt colder, the shadows deeper. The forest started to feel heavy, like it was pressing in. I tried to ignore it. Maybe I was just tired. As I kept walking, I noticed something strange. The trail looked less used, like it hadn't been walked on in a long time. Branches hung low across the path. Moss grew thick over the rocks. It didn't match what I remembered from the maps. I started to wonder if I had taken a wrong turn. I pulled out my phone to check my GPS, but there was no signal, not even a blip. That wasn't unusual this far out, but it still made my stomach tighten. I kept moving forward, hoping the trail would loop back around. By the time the sun started to dip behind the trees, I hadn't found a decent place to stop. The ground was either sloped, rocky, or too dense with underbrush. I pushed forward until I found a small patch of flat ground near a fallen tree. It wasn't ideal, but it would work. I set up my tent quickly, cooked another meal, and tried to relax. That night was different. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a weird tension in my chest, like something was off. I kept hearing faint rustling sounds, far away but constant. Not animal sounds, not footsteps either, just a dry, brushing noise, like something moving slowly through leaves. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to listen. But the more I focused, the quieter it became, until I started to think I was imagining it. Eventually, I fell into a shallow sleep. When I woke up, the air inside the tent was freezing. My breath made clouds. It was still dark outside, but I had the urge to move. I packed up in a rush and started walking with my headlamp on. My legs were sore and my back ached from the cold night. That morning, the trail became even harder to follow. It narrowed into a faint line between trees. Branches clawed at my jacket, and the forest seemed denser than ever. I checked my compass repeatedly. The direction felt wrong. I should have been heading back toward the loop, but the forest just kept stretching ahead. Around noon, I came across something that made me stop cold. There was a torn piece of fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. It looked old, sun-bleached and frayed, like it had been there for months. Nearby, I saw a broken trekking pole leaning against a rock. No other signs, no bags, no gear, nothing else. Just those two things. I stood there for a long time, staring at the items. I felt a growing sense of dread in my gut. I hadn't seen any other hikers since I started. Whoever had dropped these things hadn't come back for them. That meant something had gone wrong. I decided to keep moving, but I marked the spot with a strip of orange tape from my pack. I picked up my pace, hoping to find a clearer trail or some kind of sign that I was getting close to the loop again. Hours passed, and the forest only got thicker. I was running low on water, so I started cutting across in the direction where I thought I might find another stream. The terrain got rougher. I had to climb over deadfall and push through thickets of brambles. I slipped a couple of times, scraping my hands on rocks. Eventually, I found a dry creek bed. No water, just smooth stones and twisted roots. I followed it downhill, hoping it would lead me to a stream, but it just kept winding deeper into the woods. The trees were so close together that it felt like I was walking through a tunnel. The sky was barely visible. It was late afternoon when I found what looked like a clearing. I pushed through the trees and stepped into it, only to stop short. The space was about the size of a backyard, flat and overgrown with grass. In the middle of it was a pile of gear, a torn-up tent, a couple of crushed pots, and a backpack half covered in moss. It looked like it had been there for a long time. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there, frozen. There was no blood, no bones, nothing like that. But it felt wrong. Abandoned. Forgotten. Like someone had been here and never left. I backed away slowly and turned around. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I didn't set up camp. I just found a dry spot under a tree, wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, and leaned against my pack. I kept the headlamp on low and listened. The brushing sound was back, faint and far away, moving slowly around me. I never saw anything. I never heard a voice or a footstep, just that steady rustling, as if something was circling. To first light, I started hiking again. I didn't even eat. I just packed up and moved. My legs were shaking. My hands were numb. I felt like I hadn't really slept in 2 days. My mouth was dry and my head pounded. I kept heading west, trusting the compass, even though the forest didn't seem to change. Same trees, same moss, same silence. By midday, I was almost in tears. I hadn't seen a single sign of the loop, or the main trail, or even a boot print. Then, around a bend, I saw something that nearly made me cry from relief. A wooden trail marker nailed to a tree. It was old and faded, but I could make out the words. It listed the lake I had passed on day 1 and the trailhead I had started from. I was back on the loop. I don't know how I had gotten so far off course, but I didn't care. I followed the trail marker with everything I had. That evening, I finally reached the lake again. I camped there, too exhausted to go any further. I ate the last of my food and drank a full bottle of filtered water. I still couldn't sleep much, but it felt different, less threatening. The air didn't feel as heavy. The next morning, I hiked the last stretch of the trail back to my car. When I saw it sitting there alone in the empty lot, I almost laughed. I climbed in, turned the heat on full blast, and just sat there shaking. I never told anyone what happened out there. I don't know what I heard, or what I almost walked into. All I know is something didn't want me in that part of the forest. And if I hadn't found that trail marker, I don't think I would have made it back. It started out like any other solo hiking trip I had done before. I always planned my routes well in advance, studied maps for days, and packed extra supplies just in case something unexpected happened. That weekend, I had picked a long but not too complicated trail in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. The plan was to spend 3 days out there, hiking during the day and camping at night. I didn't expect any trouble. I had done harder hikes before. I had no idea this one would be different. I arrived at the trailhead around 6:30 in the morning. It was cold, the kind of mountain cold that slips through your clothes and settles in your bones. The air smelled like pine, wet moss, and faint traces of snow that still clung to the shaded parts of the forest. I had my backpack strapped tight, my boots laced high, and my GPS and map in my jacket pocket. Everything seemed fine. I took a picture of the trail map posted at the start, checked my gear one last time, and started walking. The first part of the trail was easy. It followed a well-worn path through thick woods. Tall pines and fir trees grew on both sides, and I could hear the soft sound of a creek not too far off to my right. I hiked steadily, covering ground quickly. Birds chirped overhead, and small animals rustled in the underbrush. I felt comfortable, confident. This was what I loved about hiking, being out there alone, away from the noise of people, work, and everything else. By late morning, I had reached the edge of a narrow ridge that overlooked a steep valley. The wind had picked up by then. It wasn't strong enough to worry me, but it kept pushing cold air into my face and made my nose run. I pulled up my hood and kept moving. Around noon, I stopped to eat. I found a flat rock, took off my pack, and ate a sandwich with jerky and a protein bar. I drank water, checked my map again, and figured I was making good time. I still had at least 7 miles to go before I would reach the small clearing where I planned to camp for the night. I packed up and kept going. The trail curved up and around the side of a hill. The trees started to thin out a bit, and I got more sunlight on my face. But that stretch of trail was rough. There were loose rocks, small landslides, and parts of the path were only a foot wide with sharp drops on one side. I had to move slower there. I had to stay focused. One bad step and I could have gone sliding 30 feet down into rocks and bushes. I didn't like how narrow it was, but it only lasted for about half a mile before it opened back up into thicker forest. Around 3:30, the sky started to cloud over. I checked my phone's weather app, but I didn't have service anymore. I wasn't surprised. This part of the mountains was notorious for dead zones. I looked up at the sky and figured I still had time before any serious weather hit. The wind had died down, but now everything was quiet. Strangely quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just the sound of my boots crunching on the trail. About 30 minutes later, I reached a fork in the trail that wasn't on my map. I stopped and stared at it for a while. The path I had been following split into two. The right fork looked newer, wider, slightly better maintained, like someone had been through recently. The left fork looked older and less used. According to my map, there should have been only one route here. I stood there for a long time trying to figure out what to do. I decided to follow the right path, thinking maybe the map hadn't been updated or maybe it had been rerouted. I walked for another hour before I started to realize something was wrong. The trail was leading downhill, steeply. I knew I was supposed to go higher before reaching the clearing. I stopped and pulled out my GPS. The screen kept blinking and wouldn't lock onto my position. I tried turning it off and on. Nothing. I was too deep into the mountains. I pulled out my compass. I knew the clearing should be northeast from my last known point. The trail I was on now curved too far south. That didn't sit right with me. I turned around to backtrack, but after about 15 minutes of walking, I stopped and looked around. Nothing looked familiar. The trees looked different. The slope of the hill didn't feel the same. I kept walking, thinking I just needed to go a little further, but after another 10 minutes, I still didn't see the fork I had come from. It was like it had vanished. I stopped again, this time a bit more nervous. I felt this tightness in my chest. I wasn't panicking, but I could feel the edge of it. I took off my pack, drank some water, and sat on a rock. I needed to think. I figured I had 2 hours of daylight left, maybe less. I could keep walking and hope to find the fork again or find a familiar part of the trail, or I could find a safe place to make camp and wait until morning to figure it out. I decided to camp. I found a flat spot near a cluster of boulders, away from the trail. I cleared the ground, pitched my small tent and laid out my sleeping pad and bag. I boiled water and made a simple dinner. As I ate, I kept looking around. The forest felt heavy, like it was watching me. I didn't hear anything, but that silence still felt wrong. I zipped up my tent before dark, crawled into my bag, and tried to sleep. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside my tent. It wasn't a big animal, no heavy steps or breathing, but I could hear something brushing against the tent. Light movements, like fingers dragging across the fabric. I held my breath. I didn't move. It went quiet again. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time behind my tent. I grabbed the small knife I kept beside me, but I didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, heart pounding. It finally stopped after what felt like forever. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until it got light out, packed my gear, and got moving. I tried again to use my GPS. Still nothing. I headed in what I thought was the right direction. The forest looked different in the morning, but it didn't help much. I kept walking. By noon, I had hiked for nearly 5 hours, but I still hadn't found anything familiar. I hadn't seen another person since I started the hike. Not even distant sounds. I started to wonder if I was walking in circles. The terrain looked similar but not the same. I tried marking trees with scratches from my knife, but after a while, I didn't even see those marks anymore. Either I missed them or I had changed direction without realizing it. My water was getting low. I still had food, but that wouldn't help much if I got dehydrated. By the third day, I had to admit I was lost. Really lost. I wasn't on any marked trail. I hadn't seen signs, other hikers, or even trash. Nothing. Just endless trees, rocks, and dirt. I started yelling occasionally, just in case someone was nearby, but no one ever answered. That evening, I found a stream. It was the first good thing to happen since I lost the trail. I drank as much as I could, filled my bottles, and followed it downstream, hoping it would lead to a larger body of water or a forest road. It twisted and turned, and sometimes I had to climb over fallen logs or cross from one side to the other. But I kept following it. That night, I didn't sleep much again. I kept hearing noises, not the same as the brushing sound from the other night, more like cracking branches and something pacing in the dark. I never saw anything, but I kept my knife close and made sure my fire stayed lit. On the fourth day, I saw a clearing up ahead. My legs were sore. My feet had blisters. I hadn't eaten much that day, but I pushed through. When I reached the clearing, I almost cried. On the far side, there was a small wooden structure, an old fire lookout tower. I rushed to it, climbed the stairs, and checked inside. It was empty, but there was a roof, a bench, and a broken-down radio. I tried the radio anyway. No response. Still, I had shelter. I stayed there overnight. The next morning, I climbed up the roof and waved a reflective blanket in the air every hour or so. Around midday, I finally saw a helicopter in the distance. I signaled like crazy. The chopper circled a few times and eventually dropped a rescue worker by cable. When he reached me, I almost collapsed. He helped me into a harness and got me up into the helicopter. Turns out, I had wandered nearly 15 miles off course. That unmarked trail must have been an old fire road or logging path not updated on recent maps. I had gotten turned around completely, and if I hadn't found the stream and followed it, I might have never made it out. I spent 2 days in a hospital recovering from dehydration and exhaustion. My feet took weeks to heal, but I survived. No ghosts, no demons, just a bad route, bad luck, and some bad decisions. That trip reminded me just how unforgiving the wilderness can be, even when you think you're prepared. Now, whenever I hike, I carry a satellite messenger. I update my maps more often. I tell more people where I'm going. And I never trust a fork in the trail that isn't marked. Because sometimes, the scariest thing out there isn't a monster. It's getting lost and realizing that no one even knows you're missing. It was early October when I decided to go hiking in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. I had a few days off work and wanted some time away from everything. No phone, no emails, no noise. just the mountains and me. I'd always loved the feeling of being out in the middle of nowhere, completely surrounded by nature. I packed my gear carefully. Sleeping bag, food for 4 days, 2 bottles of water with a filter, my first aid kit, extra clothes, a compass, a detailed map of the area, and my small but sturdy tent. I carried a bear spray can too, clipped to the side of my backpack. The trail I planned to hike wasn't one of the popular ones. It wasn't dangerous, but it was more remote than most. Fewer people meant more quiet. I'd read that the route would take me up past a series of small alpine lakes and through a few narrow passes. The weather forecast looked decent, some light showers maybe, but nothing too serious. On the first day, I parked my car at the trailhead, about an hour outside of a small town. The sky was a bit overcast, but the air was crisp and clean. The trees were all turning colors, bright reds, golds, and deep oranges. Felt perfect. I started walking mid-morning and made good time. The trail wound upward through dense pine forest, occasionally opening up to views of the surrounding peaks. By late afternoon, I reached the first lake. It was smaller than I'd imagined, but peaceful. The surface was glassy and untouched. I set up my tent near the edge of the trees, far enough from the water but close enough to hear the wind brushing across the lake's surface. After dinner, I sat near a flat rock overlooking the lake until the sun dipped behind the hills. There were no other hikers in sight. It was completely silent except for a few birds and the occasional splash from the water. That first night, I slept well. The air got cold, but my sleeping bag held up. I woke early and kept moving. Day 2 was harder. The trail grew steeper, and parts were covered in loose rock and roots. I had to take it slow. Around midday, it started to rain lightly. I pulled out my rain jacket and kept going. I hadn't seen a single person so far. That's when I noticed something strange. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of one. The forest went completely quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just my own breathing and the soft crunch of my boots on the trail. I stopped and looked around. There was nothing there, just trees and wet ground. Still, it made me feel uneasy. I tried to shake it off and kept walking. Later that afternoon, I reached a small clearing. There were signs that someone had camped there not long ago. Ashes in the fire pit, a broken branch where someone might have hung food. But something felt off. The fire pit had been scattered, like someone had kicked it apart in a hurry. A few small items lay nearby, an old sock, a torn piece of tarp. No footprints though, probably washed away by the rain. I didn't like the feeling that came over me. I chose not to camp there. I kept walking even though my legs were tired. A few miles later, I found a narrow stretch of trail that ran between 2 steep ridges. The map had shown a small flat spot just beyond that, where I could pitch my tent. I reached it right as the last bit of light faded. That night, it rained harder. The sound on the tent kept me awake longer than usual. I kept thinking about the ruined campsite, about why someone would leave in such a rush. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard something. Not the rain, something else. Heavy footfalls. Not a bear. More steady, like boots. I held my breath and sat up. The sound came closer, then stopped. I waited, then nothing. Just the rain again. I didn't sleep much after that. The first light, I packed up and moved out fast. The trail that morning was rough, wet and slippery with loose stone in parts. I kept thinking I was hearing someone behind me. I'd stop and look, but nothing. A few times I could have sworn I saw movement up the trail, a figure disappearing around a bend, but it was too fast, too far. I told myself it was just my nerves. Around midday, I reached a fork in the trail. The left path led to the last lake on my route. The right would loop back down toward the valley and eventually to the trailhead, though it would take longer. I stood there for a long time. The map showed the left trail as shorter, more direct, but it also went through a narrow, wooded canyon. I wasn't sure what made me choose the right trail. Maybe it was instinct. I kept going, but the feeling of being followed wouldn't go away. I started glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I never saw anything clearly, but I began hearing sounds again. Not animals, not birds, snapping branches, rocks being moved. Once, a loud, deliberate thud, like something hitting a tree hard. It didn't sound like a person walking naturally. It sounded intentional. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. My legs hurt, my back was sore, and I was soaked through. I came to a wider part of the trail where it looked like an old campsite used to be. A large fallen log, flattened grass. I decided to stop there. I set up my tent quickly, trying to ignore the rising panic inside me. I didn't eat much that night. I just sat there listening. Nothing. Then later, footsteps again. This time right outside my tent. Slow. Measured. I held my breath. I reached for my bear spray. The sound stopped. Then a dragging noise. Not loud. Just enough to let me know someone or something was still out there. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from pure exhaustion. When I woke up, it was just starting to get light. I stepped out carefully. The ground was wet, but I could see marks. Not boot prints. Drag marks, like someone had pulled something heavy through the dirt. I followed them a little way, heart pounding. They led into the trees and disappeared. I didn't waste time packing. I shoved everything into my pack and took off fast. I didn't stop to eat, didn't take breaks. I just kept moving. The trail twisted and dropped fast, and I nearly fell more than once. I was breathing hard, lungs burning, but I didn't care. By late morning, I started seeing signs of other hikers. A discarded energy bar wrapper, fresh boot prints in the mud. Relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I followed the trail until I finally reached the parking lot. My car was there, couple other vehicles too. I didn't look back. I threw my gear in the back seat, started the engine, and drove straight into town. I didn't stop until I was sitting in a gas station parking lot, hands shaking. I never figured out what happened out there. I checked news reports later, nothing. No missing hikers, no animal attacks. Just silence. Maybe it was a hunter or another hiker playing some sick game. Maybe it was just my imagination getting carried away. But something was out there, watching me, following me. I'm sure of it. I haven't gone hiking alone since. I still love the mountains, but I stay on the busier trails now. I don't stray far, and I always keep looking over my shoulder, just in case. It was early October when I decided to do a solo hike in the Northern Cascades. I had been hiking for a few years now, mostly day hikes or one-nighters, but this time I wanted to do a full 3-day hike deep into the mountains. I was drawn to a particular trail I'd read about in a forum, one that looped through a remote part of the forest where cell service was non-existent. The trail was listed as moderate to hard and not very popular. That was what appealed to me. I wanted solitude, just me, the mountains, and the sound of the wind through the trees. I parked my car at a small gravel pullout where the trail started. The air was crisp, and everything smelled like pine and damp leaves. I made sure I had all my gear: tent, sleeping bag, a full pack of food, extra layers, water filter, and emergency supplies. I also carried a personal locator beacon in case something went really wrong. I knew I had to be cautious. No one would be out here to help if I twisted an ankle or got lost. The first day of the hike was peaceful. I followed a winding trail that climbed steadily through dense forest. Occasionally, the trees opened up and I could see distant mountain peaks capped with snow. I stopped around mid-afternoon to set up camp near a small creek. The ground was covered in soft pine needles, and I found a nice flat area a little off-trail where I wouldn't be disturbed. That night, I slept fine. I heard the usual night sounds: crickets, wind rustling the branches, a few distant howls that could have been coyotes. Nothing felt out of place. I woke up early the next morning, made oatmeal and coffee, packed up and kept going. The second day's leg of the hike was more intense. The trail became steeper and less defined. Some parts were muddy and others had washed out sections where I had to use tree roots and rocks to pull myself up. By early afternoon, I reached a ridge with a view that made the whole trip worth it. Endless trees below, and ahead, a lake in the distance, my destination for the night. The lake wasn't marked on most maps. I'd only seen it mentioned in a comment on the hiking forum. Supposedly there was an old, unmaintained trail that led there, so I kept an eye out. After some backtracking and searching, I found what looked like a faint footpath leading down into a thick patch of trees. The trail was barely visible and seemed to have been forgotten. I checked my GPS just to be sure I was going in the right direction, then headed in. The descent was tough and I slipped a few times on loose rock. Branches scratched at my arms and face, and I had to duck and weave through tight sections. The deeper I got, the darker it became. Even though it was still afternoon, the tree cover made it feel closer to evening. Finally, the path opened up and I stepped into a clearing by the lake. It was beautiful, small, completely still, surrounded by forest on all sides. I didn't see any signs of recent campers. I felt like I had discovered a secret place. I set up my tent near the water, collected firewood, and cooked dinner. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the temperature dropped too. I put on my warmest layer and sat by the fire, staring out over the lake. That night I couldn't sleep. I wasn't scared, but I felt uneasy. The kind of feeling you get when you're being watched. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. Still, I kept my headlamp and knife close by just in case. Around midnight, I thought I heard something. A snap of a branch or something heavier than a raccoon moving through the woods. I sat up and listened. Nothing. Total silence. Eventually, I dozed off, waking up a few times to check around with my light. I didn't see anything. The next morning, I packed up and decided to take a shortcut back to the main trail. Instead of climbing back the way I came, I figured I could follow the creek that fed into the lake and link back up to the trail later. It would shave a few hours off the return trip, or so I thought. I filled up my water bottles, double-checked my GPS, and started walking. First, it went smoothly. The creek was easy to follow, and there were patches of game trails along the banks. I moved steadily downhill for a while, but then the terrain got rough. Large fallen trees blocked my path, and the forest got denser. My GPS started acting up too, showing weird routes and jumping around. I assumed it was just the thick forest messing with the signal. After an hour, the creek split. One branch went left and the other right. My gut said to follow the left, but the right looked easier to walk. I stood there for a while before choosing the right-hand fork. That was my mistake. The farther I went, the more I started to notice things felt off. The forest here was different. Thicker, with more deadfall, and quieter. Too quiet. No birds, no bugs, nothing. Just the sound of my own footsteps. I tried to convince myself it was just because I was tired, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had wandered into a place I wasn't supposed to be. Eventually, I realized I wasn't following the creek anymore. It had narrowed to a trickle and disappeared into a boggy area filled with tall grass and standing water. I tried to backtrack, but I couldn't find the fork. Everything looked the same. I checked my GPS again. Blank screen. Dead battery. That made no sense. It was fully charged this morning. I kept moving, hoping I'd find a landmark or get high enough to get a signal. Hours passed. My legs hurt, my pack felt heavier than ever, and my water was low. I didn't want to panic, but I knew I was lost. I decided to stop for the night and set up camp in a small dry spot between trees. That night was worse than the last. I heard noises again, this time closer. Movement, breathing, maybe. I held my knife and sat in the tent for hours, not sleeping, just listening. Nothing happened, but I felt like something was out there, watching, waiting. In the morning, I packed up as fast as I could and started hiking. I didn't care about trails anymore. I just wanted out. I kept heading in one direction, using the sun as a guide. The forest never ended. More fallen trees, more swampy ground, more disorientation. I started yelling occasionally, hoping someone would hear. No one did. On the third day, I ran out of food. My legs were covered in cuts and bruises from pushing through brush. I slipped into a creek and soaked my only dry socks. My compass spun in slow circles, useless. I started to wonder if I'd ever get out. Then, late in the afternoon, I saw something. An old fence post sticking out of the ground, rotted and leaning. I rushed toward it and found more signs of civilization. A collapsed wooden structure, maybe an old cabin or shed, completely overgrown. Beyond that, an overgrown path barely wide enough for one person. I followed it. That path eventually led to a dirt road. When I saw tire tracks in the mud, I almost cried. I followed the road for miles until I reached a small ranger station. It was closed for the season, but there was a map posted outside. I found my location, nearly 10 miles off from where I was supposed to be. I walked another 2 hours before a truck finally passed and gave me a ride back to the highway. From there, I hitchhiked to a nearby town and got help contacting the authorities. They took down my story, gave me food, and helped me recover my car. Looking back, I made a lot of mistakes. I took a trail that wasn't maintained, trusted unverified info, went off-trail alone, and ignored that gut feeling telling me something was wrong. I didn't tell anyone the exact path I was taking either. I haven't hiked alone since. I still go out, but only on marked trails and only with someone else. I learned the hard way that nature doesn't care about your plans. One wrong turn can turn a peaceful hike into a nightmare. And sometimes, being alone out there isn't peaceful. It's dangerous. The mountains are beautiful, but they don't forgive carelessness. That place near the lake, I never found it on any map after that. It was like it didn't exist, but I remember it. I remember how quiet it was. Too quiet. I think if I hadn't kept moving, hadn't trusted my instincts that last day, I might not be writing this now. I was lucky. Next time, I might not be. I decided to take a long solo hiking trip deep into the Bitterroot Mountains in Idaho. I had been working nonstop for months and needed a break from the noise and rush of everything. I always felt more at peace when I was out in nature, away from people, away from traffic, just walking, breathing, and listening. I had planned for a 4-day hike, carrying everything I needed: tent, food, water filter, tools, bear spray, first aid, a GPS tracker, and 2 power banks for my phone. I packed light, but I didn't cut corners on safety. The first day started off great. I parked my car near a marked trailhead and began the hike under a bright blue sky. I kept a steady pace, the trail was well maintained, and the air was crisp. Pines towered on both sides of me, and the only sounds I could hear were the wind through the trees and birds calling out. I hiked for nearly 10 miles that day and camped near a small stream. That night, I made a fire, ate my food, and slept without any problems. The second day, the trail got more rugged and isolated. I barely saw any signs of other hikers. It didn't bother me though. That was part of the appeal. I pushed further uphill and reached a ridge where I had a view of the valley below. It was one of the most peaceful things I had seen in a long time. Just endless trees, steep slopes, and no signs of human life. That night, I set up camp again, this time a bit further from any water source, but I had filled my water bladder and bottle before leaving the stream. On the third day, I made the mistake of trying to cut across a more remote part of the terrain to shave off some time. My map showed a faint path leading west that would take me through a dense area of forest before reconnecting to the main trail the next day. It didn't look too bad on paper, and I had the GPS for backup, so I figured I'd be fine. I followed the faint path, and within a couple of hours, the trail disappeared under thick brush and fallen trees. I had to start bushwhacking. The deeper I went, the thicker the woods got. The sun was high, but down below the trees, it was dark and hard to navigate. I kept checking the GPS to make sure I was still heading in the right direction. After about 5 hours of slogging through dense undergrowth, something felt wrong. My GPS showed that I was going in the right direction, but I wasn't seeing any landmarks I had marked on my paper map. No small stream, no rocky clearing, nothing, just forest. Thick, quiet forest. I stopped to rest. I checked the GPS again and noticed the battery had drained faster than I expected. One power bank was already out, the other only had 40% left. I tried not to panic. I ate a protein bar and took some water. I figured I would backtrack to a more open spot and pitch the tent there for the night. That's when I realized I wasn't exactly sure which direction I had come from. Everything around me looked the same. Just endless pine trees, uneven ground, and no clear trail. I picked a direction I thought was back the way I came and started walking. I kept an eye out for broken branches or signs of my earlier steps, but the forest was swallowing everything up. After what felt like an hour, I realized I was just going in circles. My GPS showed I had barely moved. I finally gave up and set up camp right there on a flat spot between some trees. It was still early evening, but I didn't want to risk getting more lost. I gathered some sticks for a fire, made a small flame, and sat down. I felt uneasy. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me sit up and listen. I thought I heard footsteps once, but it was probably an animal. Still, I gripped the bear spray tight in my hand as I lay in the tent. The fourth day was worse. I woke up to the sound of light rain hitting the tent. I packed up quickly and tried to use the GPS again. It worked, but barely. The signal kept cutting out, and the map was slow to load. I picked a direction that seemed to lead to a more open area and started walking again. The rain made everything slippery and slowed me down. My boots were soaked through. After hours of hiking, I came across an old logging road. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was still a clear path. I followed it for miles, hoping it would lead me back to something familiar or at least to a place where I could get a better signal. But instead of taking me out of the woods, it seemed to go deeper in. The trees got thicker, and the road became more overgrown. I found an old cabin that afternoon, half collapsed and covered in moss. It was surrounded by junk. Rusted barrels, pieces of metal, old bottles. It looked abandoned for decades. I didn't want to stay near it, but I needed shelter. The rain hadn't stopped. I stepped inside. The roof was caved in on one side, but the other half was dry enough to sit under. I ate some jerky, changed my socks, and looked over my map again. Nothing was adding up. By evening, I moved a few hundred feet away from the cabin and pitched the tent again. I didn't want to sleep near that place. Something about it made my skin crawl. That night was the worst. I heard sounds in the forest, snapping branches, not small ones, loud cracks like something heavy was moving out there. I stayed inside my tent, holding my knife and bear spray. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun came up, I packed everything and started walking again. I followed the logging road as far as I could until it ended at a dry creek bed. My GPS was dead now. I had only my map and compass. I guessed at the direction and kept going, even though every step felt heavier. My body was tired. My legs ached. My feet were raw. By late afternoon, I finally heard something I hadn't heard in days. The sound of a car engine, faint but real. I pushed toward the sound, crashing through the trees until I stumbled out onto a gravel road. A real road. Within half an hour, I flagged down a pickup truck. The man inside took one look at me, mud-covered, soaked, exhausted, and offered me a ride without hesitation. He drove me back to my car, which was still parked at the trailhead, dusty and untouched. I sat in the car for a long time before starting it, just breathing. I didn't even realize how bad I smelled until I turned on the air. That hike was supposed to be peaceful, a break. But it turned into one of the most exhausting and terrifying experiences of my life. No ghosts, no strange creatures, just the forest, the silence, the disorientation, the feeling of being so small and helpless when nature turns on you. Since then, I've gone hiking again, but I stick to well-marked trails. I carry a satellite beacon now, and I never, ever try to take shortcuts through places I don't understand. Because when you're truly lost out there, it doesn't take a monster to scare you. Just the realization that you don't know where you are, and no one else does either. After months of working late, barely sleeping, and dealing with non-stop city noise, I decided to take time off and head into the mountains. I didn't want to go to any crowded national parks or popular hiking spots where I'd run into tourists taking selfies. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be far away from everything familiar. I wanted nature, real, untouched nature. So I picked a place I had only heard about in some old hiking forums. The Ridge Trail in a remote part of the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. It wasn't part of any national park or popular recreation area. It was one of those old Forest Service trails that had mostly fallen off the radar. The few trip reports I could find mentioned that it was rough, long, and isolated, but beautiful. It sounded perfect. I packed my gear over the course of a few days. I went through everything twice. My sleeping bag, ultralight tent, food for 5 days, a good backpacking stove, water filter, GPS, printed maps, and 2 extra power banks for my phone and headlamp. I added a first aid kit and extra layers because the temperature dropped fast at high elevation, even in summer. I double-checked everything, then drove out alone. The trailhead was down a dusty forest road with no signage. I only found it because someone online described a turnoff near an old hunting cabin. Sure enough, after bouncing over rocks and weaving through trees, I spotted the rotting wooden remains of the cabin and a little wooden sign, cracked in half, barely leaning against a tree. It just said, RT-27. That was it. No information board, no warnings, no trash cans, just the forest, quiet and still. I parked, locked up, slung my pack over my shoulders, and stepped into the trees. The first day was beautiful. The air smelled of pine and damp moss. Sunlight filtered through the canopy. The trail, though narrow, was easy to follow. I hiked for hours, stopping occasionally to rest, eat, or adjust my gear. I saw no one, not a single person or any sign that anyone had been there recently. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing beside a stream and set up camp. I boiled some water, ate freeze-dried lasagna, and sat by the stream with my boots off, feeling calm for the first time in months. That night, I slept early. The forest felt safe. I heard owls and the rustle of small animals. I didn't think twice about it. The second day, the trail climbed higher. Switchbacks wound up the slope of the ridge. I had to take frequent breaks to catch my breath. My legs burned, and I was drenched in sweat. But the views were worth it. Mountains stretched out in every direction, blue and endless. I spotted a hawk circling far above me. Below, nothing moved. There were no towns, no cell towers, just wilderness. At one point, I noticed that the trail markers, little strips of orange tape, were farther apart. Some were old, barely visible, like they hadn't been replaced in years. I almost lost the trail twice, but managed to stay on course using my map and GPS. I kept going until late afternoon and found a flat spot under a stand of tall pines. I pitched my tent again, filtered water from a nearby seep, and watched the sun dip behind the ridge. It got cold quickly. I bundled up, crawled into my bag, and drifted off, tired and sore but happy. That night, I woke up once to pee and noticed it was dead quiet. No wind, no bugs, no rustling, just total silence. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. Then I went back inside and fell asleep. The third day was when things changed. I woke up early and packed up quickly. I wanted to cover more ground and reach a lake I'd seen on the map, Highview Lake, a small alpine lake a few miles ahead. The trail narrowed and got rougher. Fallen trees forced me to climb over or detour around. At one point, I slid on loose gravel and scraped my hand badly. It bled for a while and I had to wrap it. Around noon, I crossed a rocky saddle and saw the lake down below, a shimmering oval nestled in a bowl of granite and trees. It looked untouched. No campsites, no signs of people. I made my way down and reached the lake by mid-afternoon. I found a soft patch of grass near the shore and dropped my pack. The water was ice cold. I didn't swim, but I washed my face and hands, then sat down and ate. I had a weird feeling there, nothing obvious, just a sense of being watched. I kept looking around, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sounds, no movement in the trees. Just that feeling like someone's eyes were on me. I stayed only a few hours. Something made me want to move on. So I left the lake behind and climbed back up the ridge. The trail was hard to follow again. I started seeing signs of erosion, old washouts, broken logs, missing trail markers. My GPS kept cutting out. I figured it was just the terrain. I kept moving until I reached a wide flat ledge halfway up the ridge. I set up camp there, figuring I'd descend the other side tomorrow and loop back. My plan was a 5-day loop. This was day 3. That night was different. Couldn't sleep. At first, I thought it was just soreness or maybe too much caffeine from the energy drink I had with dinner. But it felt deeper than that. Something wasn't right. I lay still in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open in the dark, just listening. I heard something. It wasn't an animal. I know what deer or elk sound like when they move. This was slower, heavier, something stepping carefully through the brush, then stopping, then another step, then silence. It circled my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest so hard I thought it would give me away. Whatever it was didn't make any noise beyond those slow steps. No sniffing, no growling, just movement, then nothing. I don't know how long I stayed frozen. Eventually, I must have dozed off because I woke up again at dawn, alive and alone. I stepped outside and checked the ground. Nothing, no prints, no broken branches, but the feeling stuck with me. I packed up and pushed on. By the fourth day, the trail was gone. I don't mean hard to find, I mean gone, just gone. I followed where it should have been, based on my GPS and the map, but I didn't see any sign of it. No markers, no footpath, no evidence anyone had ever been through that stretch. Still, I had enough experience to follow the terrain and keep my bearings. I dropped lower into a valley. It was darker there, with thick underbrush and twisted trees. I got scratched up pretty badly pushing through branches. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen any animal tracks either. No deer scat, no chipmunks, no birds, nothing. The whole place felt empty, not quiet, just wrong. Around midday, I heard something again. Not close, just faint, but clear. It was metal clinking, like a tool or a pan. It echoed off the ridge. I couldn't tell the direction, but it was real. I stopped and listened for several minutes, trying to pinpoint it, but it didn't repeat. I should have felt relieved. If there was someone else out here, that meant help, right? But instead, it made me nervous. I had the gut feeling that I shouldn't go looking for whoever it was. I kept walking. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. I had scratches all over my legs. My wrapped hand throbbed. My back hurt, and I still hadn't found the trail. The GPS battery was low. I needed rest. I made camp on a rocky slope with no flat ground. I didn't care anymore. I boiled the last of my clean water and ate something small. I didn't even take off my boots. That night, it came back. The sound. Footsteps. Close. Slow. Then breathing. Not deep, heavy breathing, but soft, careful breathing. Right outside the tent. I didn't move. I had my knife beside me, but I didn't grab it. I just waited. The breathing stayed for what felt like forever. Then silence again. I waited another hour before unzipping the flap and looking outside with my headlamp. Nothing. I wanted to leave right then and there, but it was pitch black, and I had no clear path. So I sat up the rest of the night, too scared to lie down. By dawn, I decided to get out. No more exploring. No more trying to finish the loop. I just wanted to go back the way I came. But I couldn't. Everything looked different. The ridge was shaped differently than I remembered. I climbed to a high point to orient myself, but even the valleys and peaks didn't match the map anymore. I checked my GPS, and it was dead. Both power banks were drained. I had no signal, no direction, no trail, just the forest. I picked what I thought was the right direction and started walking. Hours passed. I was losing energy fast. I ran out of water and had to find a stream to refill and purify. My food was low. I kept stumbling over roots and sliding on mossy rocks. Then I heard it again. The clinking, this time closer. Then it stopped. I crouched low, hidden behind a boulder, and waited. After a few minutes, I saw movement. A man. He was maybe 50 yards away, half visible through the trees, standing still. It was late September when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the Bitterroot Mountains in western Montana. I had time off from work and I'd been feeling stressed for months. I needed something that would break me away from all the noise and pressure. I picked a 5-day loop trail that was a bit remote but not totally off-grid. I made sure to pack my gear carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, water filter, extra batteries, bear spray, GPS, topo maps, and enough food to last the trip plus an extra day. I let my brother know where I'd be and when I'd be back. The first day started easy. The The weather was cool but not cold. The leaves were just starting to turn yellow and orange. The trail was dry and well-worn. I saw a few other hikers that morning, but by late afternoon, I was alone. I found a decent flat spot a few hundred feet off the trail to set up camp. That night was calm. I boiled some water, ate a freeze-dried meal, read for a bit with my headlamp, and fell asleep around 9. Day 2, the trail narrowed and started climbing. It got steeper and more uneven. There were switchbacks with loose rock and fallen branches. My legs burned, but it felt good. I stopped to rest every now and then, taking in the silence. Around midday, I passed a small lake. It was clear and still, almost black-looking under the shade of the pines. I filled up my water bottles there and sat for a while. No one around. Just me, the wind, the water, the trees. That night, I camped higher up near a ridge. The wind picked up, making the tent flap constantly. It took me longer to fall asleep. At some point in the night, I heard something heavy walking nearby. Could have been an elk, maybe a bear. I stayed still, holding the bear spray, heart racing, until the steps faded. I didn't sleep much after that. Day 3, I crossed over the ridge and into a lower valley. The terrain flattened, but the trail got harder to follow. Parts were overgrown. A couple of sections were washed out from old mudslides. I kept checking my map and GPS to make sure I was still on track. Around noon, I came across an old wooden footbridge over a stream. It looked worn but solid. I crossed slowly, one step at a time, testing each board. Just after the bridge, I saw the first sign that something wasn't right. A pile of gear, torn up backpack, shredded jacket, and some cooking pots, half buried under a tree. It wasn't old. There was no moss or dirt built up on it. It looked like it had been there maybe a few weeks. I looked around carefully. No blood, no bones, no sign of an animal carcass. It gave me a bad feeling in my gut. I kept moving, faster than before, glancing back now and then. It started drizzling late in the afternoon. I set up camp early that day, nervous and tired. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Not loud, not close. Just distant snapping branches and the occasional rustling in the trees. I kept the bear spray close, my headlamp on, and my boots half-tied just in case I needed to move quickly. Day 4, everything started to go wrong. I woke up to find that my GPS had died. I had spare batteries, but the screen stayed black. No water damage, no sign of a break. Just dead. My phone had no signal and was mostly for photos anyway, so I had to rely on my paper map and compass from then on. I triple-checked my position and adjusted my path slightly to stay close to a creek that fed into a larger stream I recognized from the topo map. Around mid-morning, I noticed footprints. At first, I thought they were mine from the day before, but these were fresher and deeper. Someone else was nearby. The prints went the same way I was going, but then they veered off into the woods. I stopped and stared at them for a long time. The thing was, I hadn't seen anyone in 2 days, and this wasn't a popular part of the trail. A couple hours later, I noticed the smell, like something rotting. I followed the wind and found a dead deer off the trail. It had been gutted, not eaten like a predator would do, just cut open. Its legs were intact, but the belly was slashed wide, and the insides were mostly gone. Flies buzzed everywhere. The meat was still red, not fully spoiled, so it hadn't been there long. That's when I started to feel like someone was watching me. I kept moving but slower, more carefully. I didn't stop for lunch, just ate a granola bar while walking. I was sweating even though the air was cold. Every sound made me jump. The creaking of trees, my own footsteps, the wind through the brush. Late in the afternoon, I set up camp again, this time deeper in the trees, not near the trail. I cleared a spot behind thick brush and tried to hide my tent from view. I even laid branches over it. I didn't make a fire. I ate cold food and sat with my back against a tree, bear spray in hand. I didn't hear anything that night, but I didn't sleep either. Just kept staring into the dark, jumping at shadows. By morning, I just wanted out. Day 5, I packed up fast. My body ached, my eyes burned, and my stomach felt like a tight knot. I had enough food and water to make it out. I stayed off the trail as much as I could, cutting through the brush, climbing over rocks, and pushing through low trees. I wanted to avoid whoever or whatever was out there. Around mid-morning, I heard something behind me. Twigs snapping, deliberate footsteps. I ducked down and stayed still. The sounds got closer. I held my breath. Then I saw movement. A figure, maybe a man, about 40 yards away. He wasn't dressed like a hiker. He wore dark, bulky clothes. He had something slung over his shoulder. I couldn't tell what it was. I stayed crouched for maybe 10 minutes after he passed, barely breathing. Then I moved in the opposite direction, not even sure if it was the right way anymore. My legs were scratched and bleeding from all the bushwhacking. I lost my map somewhere along the way. I didn't care. I just kept walking. By afternoon, I hit a Forest Service road. I almost cried when I saw it. I followed it for a few miles and eventually came across a ranger truck parked near a small trailhead. No one was there, but I waited. About an hour later, a ranger showed up. I waved him down, told him I'd gotten turned around on the loop. I didn't mention the gear or the deer or the man in the woods. I just said I needed a ride back. I got dropped off at my car that evening. It was untouched, just where I left it. I drove home without stopping, didn't even sleep at a motel like I'd planned. When I got home, I took a long shower, threw all my gear into the corner, and sat on the floor for what felt like hours. I didn't report anything. I still don't know exactly what I saw out there. Could have been a hunter. Could have been something worse. All I know is that I won't ever hike alone again. Not that deep, not for that long. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I hear branches snap outside my window at night. That feeling of being watched never fully went away. That trip was supposed to help me relax. Instead, it taught me that the woods aren't always empty. Sometimes they watch you back. I've always loved hiking. I'm not an expert survivalist or some ultramarathon runner, but I've been doing long solo hikes for years. There's something about being deep in the woods with just a backpack, some basic gear, and no distractions that makes me feel free. I usually stick to well-known trails, but every now and then, I get a little too curious. That's exactly what happened on a trip in late September a few years ago, when I found a narrow, overgrown path leading off the main trail. I didn't know it yet, but that small decision would lead me into one of the scariest and most exhausting experiences of my life. The hike started early in the morning at a trailhead about 2 hours from the town I was staying in. I had researched this hike ahead of time. It was part of a national forest in a rural area, mostly quiet, not a big tourist spot. The loop I planned to take was about 16 miles long. I was in good shape, the weather was perfect, cool air, no rain, not too hot. I carried a backpack with about 2 liters of water, some trail mix, jerky, a flashlight, a basic first aid kit, a knife, and a small emergency bivy sack just in case I had to stay overnight. My phone had a full charge and an offline map app. The first few hours were perfect. The forest was beautiful. Tall trees with leaves just starting to turn orange and yellow, sunlight spilling through the gaps in the branches. The trail was clear, and I only passed 1 or 2 other hikers that morning. I took short breaks every now and then, drinking water and checking my map to keep track of where I was. Around midday, I stopped by a stream to eat and rest. That's when I noticed the narrow, unmarked path. It wasn't a real trail. It looked more like an old logging road, or maybe a game trail, overgrown and half covered with leaves, but still walkable. It went steeply downhill into thicker woods. I looked at my map, no path shown. That should have been enough to keep me away, but I was curious. I thought maybe it led to a viewpoint or a hidden meadow. I figured I'd just walk down it a little way, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then come back. As soon as I stepped off the main trail, the feeling changed. The forest felt tighter, like the trees were closer together. The air was cooler, damper. The trail was rougher than I expected, and my boots slipped a few times on patches of loose dirt. I kept telling myself I'd turn around soon, but I kept thinking just a little farther. I kept walking for another 10 minutes, then another 5, and then I realized I'd lost track of how far I'd gone. When I finally stopped to turn around, I realized I didn't recognize anything. I turned to look back the way I came, but it all looked the same: trees, brush, a slope, no signs or markers, no trail. I wasn't panicking yet. I still had plenty of daylight, my phone, and my offline map. I opened the app. No signal, of course, but the GPS dot still worked. I could see where I was on the map, but the trail I had been on wasn't visible anymore. The map showed nothing but forest in every direction. I tried to retrace my steps, heading back uphill where I thought I'd come from. But the more I walked, the more unsure I became. After 20 minutes of walking, I didn't find the main trail. Everything looked unfamiliar. I kept walking, thinking maybe the trail would show up around the next ridge. But it didn't. That was when the uneasy feeling set in. Not panic, but something creeping in slowly. Like I'd made a mistake that wasn't going to be easy to fix. I stopped again, checked my water. I'd already drank 1.5 liters without realizing it. I still had some food, but not much. The sun was lower now. The shadows were longer, and the forest was getting darker, cooler. I knew I had to make a decision. I could keep trying to find the trail and risk going deeper into unknown terrain, or I could stop moving and set up somewhere for the night. I didn't want to sleep out there, but the smart part of my brain was telling me that wandering in circles would just get me more lost. I found a small flat patch of ground behind a fallen tree and decided that's where I'd wait. I didn't have a tent, just a bivy sack and a rain poncho. I laid down some leaves to insulate the ground, crawled into the sack, and tried to stay warm. I wasn't scared of animals. I knew how to hang my food and keep clean. What bothered me more was the silence. The deeper parts of the forest don't sound like the places near trails or campsites. It's quieter, and the silence isn't peaceful. Presses in. Every now and then, I'd hear a crack of branches far away, or something small moving in the brush. But I told myself it was just squirrels or deer. Still, I didn't sleep much. The night was cold, and I kept waking up shivering. I tried to warm my hands under my armpits or rub my arms. The bivy sack helped a little, but not enough. I dozed in and out for a few hours until the sky finally started turning light again. I sat up, stretched my stiff legs, and ate a small handful of trail mix. My water bottle was almost empty. I looked at my map again. Still no trail near me, still deep in the green blob of forest. I marked my location with a physical landmark, a strange U-shaped tree that had grown sideways and curved back up. That way, I could find my way back if I made a loop by mistake. I started hiking again. I tried to go in one direction, straight as possible, checking the angle of the sun every hour to keep my bearings. The terrain wasn't easy. Thick brush, hidden holes, slippery leaves. I tripped more than once and scratched my arms on thorny vines. Around mid-morning, I heard running water. Not the little stream from yesterday, but a stronger flow. I followed the sound until I reached a small river. I filled my bottle, used water purification tablets, and rested. Then I made my second big mistake. Instead of following the river downstream, which might have led to a road or a campsite, I decided to cross it. I thought maybe the trail was on the other side. I took off my socks and boots, tied them around my neck, and waded across. The water was freezing, and the rocks were slick. Halfway through, I slipped and fell, soaking my clothes and slamming my knee hard on a rock. I got up limping, freezing, and angry at myself. I sat on the other side for over an hour, drying my clothes in the sun and checking my knee. It was swelling fast, and every step after that hurt. Not enough to stop me, but enough to slow me down. That second day felt longer than the first. Every tree started looking the same. I kept hearing movement, small things in the distance, cracks of branches. But I never saw anything, just shadows. Once, I saw what looked like a human figure way off through the trees, but when I moved closer, it disappeared. I told myself it was a tree or a trick of light. Still, I started to feel watched. It was probably in my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, somewhere, knew I was there. Around late afternoon, I found something that gave me hope. An old, rotting wooden signpost half buried in the ground. The letters were mostly gone, but it looked like it had once marked a trail. There was a faint path beside it, barely there, but it was something. I decided to follow it. That path led me deeper into a darker part of the forest. The trees here were older, thicker. Less sunlight reached the ground. Everything smelled like damp moss and decay. I kept walking, thinking maybe this old trail would connect to a bigger one. But after an hour, it just disappeared again, faded into nothing. I stood there, breathing hard, sore, frustrated, and unsure what to do. Then I heard something. Not an animal this time. It sounded like something heavy, stepping on dry branches, maybe 50 yards behind me. I froze, waited, nothing. I slowly turned around. No one there. I waited another minute, then moved forward again. Slowly, quietly, trying not to make noise. Then it happened again. Behind me, a step, a crunch. Not close, but not far either. That was the moment I felt true fear. Not just the fear of being lost. It was the fear of being followed, hunted. I didn't run. I didn't want to draw attention. I just kept walking, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. Every time I thought I heard something, I'd stop, listen. Nothing. Maybe it was an animal, but it didn't sound like one. It wasn't fast or random. It was paced, careful. I didn't stop that night. I walked until I couldn't anymore. I used my flashlight until the battery died, then the backup on my keychain. I finally stopped around midnight and tucked myself into a patch of ferns behind a thick tree trunk, where I thought I'd be hidden. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. I just laid there, eyes open, ears straining in the dark. Every small sound made me jump. The third day was worse. My knee was worse too, swollen and stiff. I had a hard time walking straight. I rationed the last of my food that morning. A few crumbs of jerky and some trail mix dust. I still had water, but no energy. I kept moving, slowly, but I felt like I was dragging.
My moute was dry, my legs zakken.
The fear stayed with me. Every now and then, I'd hear a step behind me again. A crack, It was late October when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip deep into the mountains of northern Idaho. The air had started to cool off, but snow hadn't yet reached the lower elevations, so it felt like the perfect time to get in one last good hike before winter. I had been planning it for weeks, studying topographic maps, researching routes, and marking down potential campsites. I picked a 40-mile loop trail that circled through some of the more remote stretches of the national forest. The area wasn't popular. Most people stuck to the more maintained trails closer to the ranger stations. This one, though, cut through rough terrain with steep inclines, dense forest, and barely used paths. It was exactly what I was looking for. I parked my truck near the trailhead at a pull-off along a Forest Service road. There were no other vehicles. That felt like a good sign. I packed light, but still had all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, freeze-dried meals, stove, GPS, maps, and a satellite phone for emergencies. I locked the truck, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The sun was out, and the trail was clear, winding through tall pines and golden aspen. I could hear the wind moving through the leaves and the sound of my boots crunching the gravel path. By late afternoon, I had made it to my first planned campsite near a creek. I set up my tent, boiled some water for dinner, and sat on a flat rock by the creek, listening to the water. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped fast. I got into my sleeping bag and listened to the wind pick up. I didn't fall asleep right away. Even though I was used to being alone outdoors, there was always a strange feeling that came with being that deep in the wilderness alone. The next morning, I packed up and started moving again. The trail started to climb steadily as I headed toward higher elevations. The forest thickened, and the path narrowed. There were no fresh footprints, no signs of recent human activity. I liked that. It made the experience feel more raw. Around midday, I came across some old animal tracks. They looked like they could have been from a bear, but they were old, faded into the mud. I kept moving. I was careful about noise. Made sure I talked out loud occasionally and hit my trekking poles together as I walked to avoid surprising anything. But still, I saw nothing. No animals, no birds, just quiet. That afternoon, The trail became harder to follow. It hadn't been maintained in years. Fallen trees crisscrossed parts of it, and thick underbrush forced me to slow down. My GPS confirmed I was still on the right route, but I had to rely more on the map and my instincts. I found a small clearing just off the trail and set up camp there for the night. It was surrounded by trees, but had enough space for my tent and a fire. I gathered wood, started a small fire, and ate dinner. The quiet started to feel heavier. It wasn't just peaceful now, it was total silence. No wind, no animals, not even bugs. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing faint snapping noises in the forest. Could have been deer or maybe small branches falling. Still, I kept waking up. On the third day, I reached the farthest point in the loop. It was the most remote section of the trail. I hadn't seen any signs of people since the first day. The trail curved along the side of a steep ridge with drop-offs on one side and dense forest on the other. I had to slow down a lot. Some of the sections were barely passable. I slipped once, scraped my knee, and had to stop and patch it up. Not serious, but it reminded me how alone I really was. No one knew where I was at that exact moment except me. By late afternoon, clouds started moving in fast. I checked the weather on my GPS device, and sure enough, a sudden cold front was moving in. High winds and maybe some snow. I didn't like the idea of being caught on the exposed ridge. I looked at the map and saw a lower valley area 1.5 miles off the trail. It looked like a good place to take shelter. I veered off the trail and followed the slope down. It was steep, and there was no path, but I moved slow and kept checking my bearings. By the time I got to the valley, the sky had turned gray. I found a spot tucked between some large boulders and trees. It offered good shelter from the wind. I set up my tent and made a quick meal. The temperature had dropped a lot, and the wind howled above me through the trees. I crawled into my sleeping bag and stayed there, listening. Sometime during the night, I heard a loud cracking noise, like a tree falling not far away. It shook the ground enough to feel it. I lay still, heart pounding, but nothing else happened. In the morning, it was cold and damp. The ground was frosted over. I packed up and planned to bushwhack my way back up to the main trail. It was slow going. I had to zigzag to avoid steep climbs and thick brush. About halfway up, I found something strange. A boot, just one, sitting upright under a small tree. It looked old, dried out, and partly buried in leaves. There were no markings around it. No bones, no backpack, no clothes. Just the boot. That shook me. I stood there for a while, staring at it. It didn't make any sense. It had to belong to someone. But where were they? I didn't touch it. I just moved on, trying to put it out of my mind. But the feeling stuck with me, like something was off. I got back to the trail by early afternoon and kept going. I made it another 6 miles before stopping for the night. I didn't eat much, just got into my sleeping bag and tried to rest. The next day was supposed to be easier, mostly downhill, but I started feeling sick. My stomach turned constantly, and I felt dizzy. I kept walking anyway. I had about 10 miles left until I was back at the truck. The trail became more overgrown, and the trees grew tighter. At one point, I stopped to rest and heard movement up ahead. I froze. It wasn't big, but it was fast. A crack, then rustling. I waited, but nothing else happened. As I walked forward, I kept thinking I was being watched. That strange, heavy silence was back again. The same feeling from the other night. I kept checking over my shoulder. At one point, I saw something move through the trees. Not a shape, just a quick flicker of motion, like someone ducking behind a tree. I stared hard, but saw nothing. I moved faster. My legs hurt, and my head throbbed, but I wanted to get out of there. At one point, I came across an old trail sign, so rusted and worn I could barely read it. I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. I wasn't on the main trail anymore. I checked my GPS. It wasn't working, just a blank screen. I tried to turn it off and on, but nothing. I pulled out my satellite phone. No signal. I tried to retrace my steps, but the path had split off in several directions. I picked the one that looked most traveled and kept walking. Hours passed. It started getting darker. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. I set up camp in a small clearing and built a small fire. I didn't eat. I just sat there, staring into the flames, listening. The forest felt like it was pressing in around me. I kept hearing small movements, twigs snapping. Not close, but not far either. I didn't sleep. I sat there all night, clutching my knife, eyes darting around. Just before dawn, I packed up and started walking again. My legs were stiff and my pack felt heavier. I moved slow. After a few hours, I found a dry creek bed and followed it. Curved downhill, and I figured it might lead toward a road or at least back to the main trail. I kept going until I found something strange again. Tarp. It was spread out between two trees like a makeshift shelter. Old, torn. There was a rusted pot nearby and some torn fabric. It had been there for a while, maybe a year or more. I looked around but saw no signs of a person. No gear, no bones, nothing. Just the tarp and rusted stuff. I didn't stop. I kept walking. I was starting to get scared in a way I hadn't felt before. Not fear of animals, but of something else. Something I couldn't explain. The creek bed eventually opened into a larger flat area, and from there I saw something that made me stop. A dirt road. Not a main road, just a Forest Service road. But it meant I was close. I followed it for nearly an hour before I saw my truck. It was exactly where I left it. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the back, and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just staring through the windshield. I made it out. Physically, I was okay. A little dehydrated, sore, and tired. But mentally, something had shifted. I couldn't stop thinking about the boot, the tarp, the things I thought I saw in the trees. When I got home, I tried to report what I saw, but without GPS coordinates or photos, it wasn't much. They took down the details and said they'd look into it. I didn't hike again for a long time after that. I stuck to local trails, ones with cell service and people. I still think about that trip. The silence, the strange objects, the feeling of being watched. I tell myself it was just the isolation, the exhaustion, maybe dehydration. It was mid-September when I decided to take a solo hiking trip up in the Kettle Ridge Range in the northern part of the state. I had a week off from work, and I didn't want to spend it at home staring at the walls. I didn't really have a plan, just a basic idea. Drive up, park near one of the lesser-used trails, and head deep into the forest for a few days. I brought my tent, a bare canister full of food, a filtered water bottle, and all the usual gear. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, but none this deep or this long. This was supposed to be a way to disconnect, to clear my head. I parked my car near an old service road that hadn't seen much use. It was already rough and rutted, and my tires barely handled it. From there, I took my pack and started moving into the forest, keeping a slow and steady pace. The trees were already starting to show a little color. A few red and yellow leaves were scattered on the ground. The air was crisp but still warm enough to make hiking comfortable. I had a paper map tucked into a waterproof sleeve, a compass, and my GPS watch. My plan was to hike about 10 to 12 miles in, set up camp near a stream, and stay there for the first night. The trail started to narrow by late afternoon. I stopped once or twice to snack and stretch my legs. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. No cars, no people, just the wind brushing through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird or squirrel. There were sections of trail so overgrown I had to push shrubs out of my face. Still, it felt good to be away from everything. I made it to a clearing just before sundown and found the stream I was looking for. I set up camp, ate a dry meal of rice and beans, and rolled out my sleeping bag inside the tent. The stars were out when I unzipped the flap and stepped outside to brush my teeth. I stood there for a while looking up. No phone signal, no internet, just the sound of the stream running nearby. That night I woke up once. Something had snapped a branch outside. It wasn't loud, just enough to stir me from sleep. I laid there listening, holding my breath, but whatever it was didn't come back. I chalked it up to a raccoon or a deer and drifted off again. The next morning, I packed up and started hiking further up into the hills. The trail I was following was marked with faded blazes on trees, but the further I went, the harder they were to find. I kept my eyes open and used the compass to stay on course. The ground was damp in places from recent rain, and I slipped once, sliding a few feet down a hill before grabbing a root. No harm done, but it reminded me I needed to stay alert. Around midday, I came across what looked like an old fire road. It wasn't on my map, but it had deep tire grooves and broken patches of gravel. Something about it made me pause. I knew I hadn't seen it marked, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it pointed roughly in the direction I wanted to go, so I followed it. The road curved through the trees, rising and falling with the terrain. I hiked for another hour before realizing I hadn't seen a single blaze or trail sign in a long while. I was officially off the trail. Still, I didn't panic. I had my GPS watch, and it showed I was still heading northeast, which matched my plan. I figured I would eventually intersect with another marked trail. I decided to keep going. After another mile or so, the road dipped into a narrow valley. The forest felt different here, thicker, quieter. Even the birds seemed absent. The sun had dipped behind clouds, and the light felt heavy and gray. I took a break and sat on a fallen log, drinking water and checking the map again. That's when I noticed something strange. There were no markings for this valley. Nothing. No contours, no water, no ridges. Just blank space on the map. I pulled out my compass again. North was still north. I felt a little uneasy, but not enough to turn back. I figured I'd follow the road a bit further and then circle back if nothing changed. I kept walking, maybe another 30 minutes. That's when I saw the first sign of human activity in a while. A metal drum, rusted and half-crushed, sitting just off the road. No labels, just old and dented. Then I saw another, and another, a few scattered beer cans, a broken shovel, all of it old, weathered, and covered in dirt and leaves. I slowed my pace. My senses felt sharp, like something was off. I don't know why, but I started scanning the woods on both sides of the trail more carefully. Up ahead, I spotted what looked like a cabin. It was tucked behind some trees, partially hidden. The roof sagged in the middle and the windows were dark. The door was shut. The wood looked gray and weathered. I stopped about 50 feet away. Something about it made my stomach tighten. There was no reason for a structure to be here. This wasn't parkland as far as I knew, and it didn't look like it had been lived in for a long time. I almost turned back. Almost. But curiosity pulled me forward. I stepped off the road and walked through the brush. The ground was soft and mossy. I got close enough to see that the door had no handle, just a metal plate. One of the windows had been shattered long ago, and there were dead leaves piled inside. I stepped onto the porch, creaked under my weight. I looked inside. Empty. Just a small table, 2 chairs, and a rusted stove in the corner. No sign of life, just abandonment. Still, I felt watched. Not by a person, but just that heavy feeling that comes when something isn't right. I didn't go in. I backed away and returned to the road. I kept moving faster this time. I no longer wanted to see where it led. I just wanted to get back on a known trail. I pulled my GPS watch and tapped it. The battery was lower than it should have been. I checked the compass again. North was now reading east. I turned in a slow circle, corrected itself, then flickered again. My sense of direction started to fray. I felt like I had walked a lot further than I should have, but I hadn't seen any intersections. The woods got denser. The road narrowed. I stopped and tried to retrace my steps, but after 10 minutes, I couldn't find the old cabin. Everything started to look the same. Trees, dirt, moss, rocks. I felt my throat tighten. My breath got shorter. That's when I heard something again. Not an animal. It sounded like a footstep. One single step behind me. I froze. Waited. Nothing. I turned slowly. No one. I scanned the trees. My heart was beating fast. I couldn't see anything. I kept walking. I didn't set up camp that night. I just kept walking. I used my headlamp when the sun set. The battery faded fast. I tripped over roots. My legs started to burn. Every so often, I thought I heard something moving behind me, but I never saw anything. Just noises, snaps, a brush of leaves. I wanted to scream but didn't. I just kept going. By midnight, I was exhausted. I found a small ridge and set my pack down. I didn't set up the tent. I just wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and tried to rest. I slept in fits, waking up every half hour, startled by every sound. At one point, I heard breathing. Not mine. Slow, deep, maybe 15 feet away. I didn't move. I just laid there, barely breathing. Eventually, it stopped. Morning came slowly. My mouth was dry, my clothes damp with sweat. I ate half a granola bar and started moving again. I tried heading west, hoping to reconnect with a known trail. My compass started working again, but I no longer trusted it. The forest looked wrong, too thick, too quiet. Then I found something that gave me hope. A trail marker, faded but real. It was red. I checked my map. It was part of a discontinued route, one that had been shut down years ago due to landslides. But it was marked. I followed it. The trail was rough, overgrown, but I pushed through. I walked all day, tripped once, scraped my shin. Blood soaked into my sock. I didn't care. I just wanted out. Just before sunset, I heard a sound I hadn't heard in 2 days. A car engine. Faint, distant, but real. I climbed a ridge and looked down. A road. A real paved road. I stumbled down, crashing through branches. When I got to it, I sat down on the shoulder and laughed. It wasn't joy. It was just release. 10 minutes later, a truck came by. I waved. The driver slowed, then stopped. I didn't say much, just asked for a ride back to the main ranger station. Back at the station, I filled out an incident report. The ranger looked at me strangely when I mentioned the cabin. He said no structures were ever approved for that area. I asked about the trail I took. He said some of those roads were logging cuts from decades ago, long since closed off. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I knew what I felt out there. Something wasn't right in those woods. I didn't hike alone again for a long time. Even now, years later, I still think about that place. I look at the map sometimes and wonder if I could find that road again. But I never try, because part of me knows that if I